Hello everybody. It is August 9th, 2025 here in the United States of America, and today's video I want to talk about some pretty big geopolitical news that just happened over the last few days. Now, for those of you who don't know, sorry, I thought my lights were flickering there. This is the shades were moving a bit. For those of you who aren't aware yet, President Donald Trump and President Vladimir Putin are set to meet in Alaska to actually discuss a concrete deal to end the war in Ukraine. This comes as a surprise to many people, given Trump's recent rhetoric, seemingly abandoning any idea of negotiating with Russia and just levying more sanctions that many people would frankly find useless against the Russian Federation to try to get them to come to the table. And it wasn't just more sanctions against the Russian Federation, it was actually sanctions against the Russian Federation's biggest trading partner in regards to energy, India and China. Now currently India and the United States are in a bit of a diplomatic spat over this. The United States is trying to get India to stop buying Russian oil or face, I believe it was 100% tariffs on all goods. And India's economy is tightly linked with the United States economy, which could hurt the Indian economy if India does not concede to the United States' demands, but also conceding would hurt the Indian economy, considering they get a very large portion of their energy needs from Russia. So, I'll keep this video brief and to the point. I'll talk about what I think the offer will likely be and the offer that makes the most sense, and if I think this offer actually suits President Vladimir Putin from his point of view, President Volodymyr Zelensky from his point of view, and President Trump from his point of view. Okay, so let's start off with what I think the offer actually is. Based on Trump's comments about trading territory and comments coming from the Kremlin that the United States offered a very acceptable deal to the Russian Federation. Now, first of all, the Russian Federation's demands since the Istanbul peace deal was rejected have basically been this: Ukraine completely withdraws from the four oblasts, Zaporizhia, Kherson, Luhansk, and Donetsk. And then at that point, a ceasefire can be discussed. On top of that, Ukraine, to permanently end the war, needs to declare itself neutral, allow elections, vow to never join NATO, that's part of the neutrality, and to get to curtail the size of its military, to get long-range weapon systems, namely NATO-supplied weapon systems, out of Ukraine and away from the Russian border. And now, if the Russians have said that Trump offered an acceptable deal, here's what I am assuming that it is. And I could be wrong. We'll find out on the 15th. I failed to mention that is the day that President Putin and President Trump are set to meet. And this is in Alaska, which is interesting. Just real quick to talk about that for a second. Alaska used to be part of the Russian Empire. It was purchased from Russia by the United States, and it's essentially the border between Russia and the United States across the Bering Straits. It's not very far to either country. So this is it's a very symbolic thing that I believe that the two leaders are meeting in Alaska. It's the closest meeting point between the two countries, and it's on American territory, which I find interesting. Some people might think that my light is flickering. I actually think my light's about to go out over there. I'll have to fix that. Anywho, back to the topic at hand, which I find interesting. Usually, whatever party goes to the other country is the party seeking something and taking the initiative to come to the table. Now, President Trump isn't going to take himself to Moscow, and the Kremlin already rejected the idea of going to Rome, so I think everyone's surprised that Alaska is the meeting place. I figured it would be the UAE or Turkey. Actually, I'd say the UAE was the most likely spot, or Saudi Arabia, but that it's on American soil, very close to the Russian Federation's territory, is interesting. So, what I think the deal is this, and I could be wrong. The Ukrainian army, and again, this comes down to whether Ukraine will accept this, the Ukrainian army withdraws completely from what is left of the territory that it holds in Donetsk and Luhansk, which in Luhansk it's a very negligible amount, and Donetsk, if they lose Pokrovsk and the other city that's surrounded, I forget the name of it exactly. If they lose Pokrovsk, I'm trying to pronounce that correctly, they have Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. Is it Lysychansk left? I'll have to look. Anyways, they have a few large settlements left, but I believe more than half of the Donetsk region, if not around half, is currently held by the Russian Federation. So Ukraine will withdraw from Donetsk and Luhansk, and in return, Russia will leave whatever territories it holds in Sumy, Kharkov, the Kharkov Oblast, and Sumy. And also, and this is the interesting point, Russia would give up its claim to the remainder of Kherson and Zaporizhia, which is interesting. But I'm assuming, though, this isn't going to happen unless the other demands of Russia are met. Ukraine declares neutrality, NATO leaves Ukraine, and Ukraine agrees to downsize its military and get NATO weapon systems out of its territory. This is what I'm assuming the deal would be, because this is the bare minimum I think that Russia would accept. Now, initially, the Russians had said they wanted all four oblasts, all the territory in all four oblasts, which means the portion of the Kherson Oblast that's on the other side of the Dnieper River, and then the rest of Zaporizhia. Now, why I think the Russians would be willing to give up what's left of the Kherson Oblast is because the tenuous position they actually found themselves in before the Ukrainian offensive in 2023. Now, Russia actually withdrew back across the Dnieper and consolidated their forces, not because of some great military defeat, but because it was too risky to keep a large contingent of troops on the opposite side of a river where there wasn't a reliable crossing. The bridges had been damaged, and to get armor and men, upwards of 50,000 men or so were on the other side of the river, could have been a logistical nightmare, and had there been some kind of rout of Russian forces, could have turned into a massacre with great numbers of POWs captured. Now, General Surovikin, who was in charge of Russian defenses in the area at the time, thought it best to withdraw Russian forces back across the Dnieper and not try to hold what was left of the Kherson Oblast. The Dnieper River is a very large natural barrier and gives whoever holds either side of it a great strategic defensive advantage. I think the Russians would be willing to give up that little bit of land on the other side of the Dnieper for practical reasons. I don't see them wanting to hold it just in case another war would break out. They would have to ensure that all bridges were restored, and multiple bridges would be built for logistical reasons in case they ever need to get troops back across the river. And also, as far as the rest of Zaporizhia goes, there's not much left. I believe fields and a few settlements, but nothing notable. Now, it's enshrined in the Russian Constitution that land is Russian. So I'm not sure what legal processes the Russians would have to go through to give that up, but I think this is the concession they made to give up further claims to these two oblasts in return for the rest of Donetsk, what's left of Luhansk, and neutrality from Ukraine, as well as the few other provisions that they demanded. This is what I think the deal is. This is the only deal that I think Russia would find acceptable. I don't think Vladimir Putin or the Russians would ever give up the land bridge to Crimea. They'd be foolish to. They're depriving Ukraine of a large part of their coastline and ensuring that Crimea can be well supplied, either through the Kerch Bridge or the land bridge that is now connecting the Russian Federation with Crimea. So I highly doubt they would ever give up that territory. So, is this a good deal for the Russians, to start off? Yes, I believe it is a good deal for the Russians. Now, some people are saying that, well, this is just a strategic defeat for the Russians. They didn't get everything they wanted. Well, if they get neutrality from Ukraine, if they get the other demands in regards to having elections in Ukraine, Zelensky stepping down, Ukrainian military downsizing, if they get that, then I believe that could be spun as a victory. It's not everything they wanted. They didn't take all of Ukraine, which they never intended to. And just to rewind things a little bit, in the original peace proposal in Istanbul, Russia actually offered to leave all of Ukrainian territories, as far as I'm aware, as long as Luhansk and Donetsk got the semi-autonomous status. If Ukraine agreed to be neutral and to get NATO weaponry out of Ukraine, it was a very, very generous deal to Ukraine. Well, as everybody knows by now, Ukraine resolved themselves to fight on. The deal was rejected, and in response to that, Russia decided then to claim those 4 oblasts as their territory. So it was kind of a punitive measure against the Ukrainian government. They gambled and they lost, so they didn't reclaim that territory through military means. I do think that this is something that President Putin would accept. Gives them most of what they want with 2 small territorial concessions. I think this can be spun as a Russian victory. Russia can get back to having normal relations with the United States. The risk of World War III greatly reduces, and Russia no longer has to endure the loss of soldiers. While I've mentioned before their casualties, I don't think crippling by any means. They were still substantial, and if this war can be brought to an end while achieving at least 90% of what Russia aimed for, then I think that would be acceptable to them. Also, moving on to President Trump, would this deal be something acceptable to President Trump? Yes, I believe it would be. Ukraine still holds the majority of their territory. This can be spun out as well. This is where the Ukrainians stopped the Russians. They didn't move any further. Ukraine gave up a little bit of Luhansk and Donetsk. In return, they can keep the rest of their sovereignty and no longer have to feel the threat of being under the Russian yoke. That's how this could be spun. And this is the most realistic outcome, I think, for President Trump if he actually wants to end the war. Because the longer this war goes on, the chance of Europe or the United States being drug into it directly only increases exponentially. Now, this risk decreased a good bit when Trump came into office because President Putin and President Trump began to communicate with one another. But again, if this war drags on, then all it takes is one event to escalate things beyond control. And again, as most people out there know, the Russian Federation and the United States of America have the 2 largest nuclear arsenals on the planet and the best delivery systems. The Russians have the Orezhnik, which is a very, very advanced delivery system, and the United States, I'm sure, has something up its sleeve as well with all the research and development that we do. So I think this is a deal President Trump would gladly propose to the Russians if it ends the war. I'm assuming along with this will be some kind of security guarantee from the Russian Federation and from the EU in regards to future military operations. Perhaps the Russians would ensure that only X amount of troops are on their western border at any given time. I'd say probably reduced to make those countries feel more comfortable, and maybe long-range weapon systems wouldn't be facing Europe, and then vice versa. You wouldn't have long-range weapon systems in Poland and other NATO countries, and then maybe perhaps part of that is no more NATO expansion to the east. Now, again, a lot of President Trump's critics will say this is too friendly to the Kremlin, but if you look at it from a pragmatic point of view, unless the Russian Federation magically collapses overnight, which there's no indication that it would, then this is probably the best possible outcome for all parties. Now, moving on to President Zelensky. Is this something that President Zelensky would accept? He has already rejected the offer, but he might not have a choice. Ukrainian hardliners will want to fight this war to the bitter end until the Russians are in the streets of Kiev, which eventually probably will happen without direct European or American intervention. It's only a matter of time. Wars of attrition are fought slowly, and then the dam breaks and things give. And I believe Ukraine was on the way to that breaking point, judging by how things were going in Donetsk. Here's the issue with President Zelensky. His government, and this is for anyone out there who's a supporter of Ukraine, I'm not trying to pick a fight. Again, I just talk about what I think the most realistic outcomes are, and I look at realities on the ground and facts as they are. Ukraine is entirely dependent on Western support. Their economy is propped up by Western money. Their military has been propped up by Western money. Not that they don't have a good military. They started this war with one of the best militaries in Europe, and they're the largest country in Europe. But at this point in the war, because they've lost so many people through mass emigration out of Ukraine and so many young men on the battlefield, and they don't really have any large-scale manufacturing capabilities of their own at this point. Now that is the rest of Europe, let's be honest, they are dependent on Western aid. If that Western aid was completely cut off by all parties, then I think people would see the results of that fairly quickly. If Europe and the United States have resolved themselves to end this war in this fashion, then Zelensky at that point is expendable. If he's resolutely refusing a peace treaty that the United States and Russia have largely agreed to, then what I would say would happen, and Zelensky needs to be careful, there's a very good chance that it will be coup. The United States and Europe is likely to want to keep this conflict going, but let's just focus on the United States. I'll leave Europe out of this for now. It is highly likely that the U.S. will look at President Zelensky as the one thing standing in the way to finally getting this peace treaty signed and averting World War III. And they will turn to Zelensky, go have a conversation with him and say, if we install you as the next Ukrainian president, are you willing to sign this deal with Russia and try to come to terms with the Russian Federation and end this war? Because after all, Russia is demanding elections. It's not just Zelensky, it's anyone else who's influential in the country. Take your pick. And if it gets to that point, Zelensky has to assume that he would be removed one way or the other. Now, the hardliners won't like it. They won't let it happen, but Western governments determine who in Ukraine gets that funding. So is this deal good for him and his political career and his survival? Probably not. But I don't think he has a choice. Ukraine, again, as I mentioned before, unless there was some kind of catastrophic collapse of Russia overnight for no reason, then Ukraine has no chance of winning this war. It will just continue to grind away at the front lines, cede territory, and eventually things will give way. They won't be able to field enough men, and they won't be able to man enough weapon systems and have enough people in the field to stop the Russian Federation from moving forward. Ukraine should have taken the peace deal offered in 2022. That was the best deal they were going to get, and they could have kept almost all of their territorial integrity. And as I've mentioned before, this might upset people. They rolled the dice. They gambled on Western support and being able to push the Russian Federation completely out of Ukrainian territory, winning a military victory. They made a gamble, and they lost. Part of losing that gamble now is permanently losing territory to the Russian Federation. Now, again, if you're somebody who's very pro-Ukraine, of course, I understand. It's a moral imperative that Ukraine retains their territory. They are sufferers of a war of aggression. I get it, but reality is reality. And if there's no physical way to take that territory back, then the leaders of Ukraine have to look at what's best for their people and what's best for what remains of their country and its territory and the people living in it. So do I think they'll sign on to this deal? Would Zelensky sign on to this deal? I don't think he will. I think he would have to be removed from office for Ukraine to accept this deal. But he might not have a choice in the matter. Now, there are parties in Ukraine who would gladly accept this deal just to end the war because they understand that this cannot go on forever. Something has to give. Would they rather lose 50% of their territory or 20% of their territory? Would they rather watch a nuclear war erupt between the Russian Federation and the United States and Europe, or would they rather not see that? Because keep in mind, if that happens, Ukraine gets obliterated. That's ground zero for all of this. It wouldn't end well for anybody there. They're in a bad situation, and I believe a lot of that comes from the very poor leadership of Volodymyr Zelensky and Ukrainian leadership as a whole in regards to this war. Yes, you can say what's right is right. They're the victims of aggression. There needs to be a just peace and justice given to them. It's all well and good, but when it comes to power politics between real politics between major world powers, it doesn't really factor in the way that people think that it should. So, anyways, the meeting between President Trump and President Putin happens on the 15th. That's next week in Alaska. I'm interested to see what the deal actually is. I could be wrong. This is the deal I'm assuming it probably would be. But I guess we'll wait and see what happens. President Trump is notoriously chaotic when it comes to his foreign policy. He says one thing one day, and then something the next day. And then also, too, will Europe try to derail this? Will Zelensky go to Europe and try to drive a wedge between Europe and the United States over this to try to keep Europe on his side to make sure that this peace deal doesn't happen? Because here's the thing. If the United States can convince Europe to go along with this peace deal, Zelensky is screwed, and he knows it. He has to at least have Europe in his corner to stand his ground where he wants to stand it at. But anyways, that's all for this video. I hope everyone enjoyed it. If you did like this video, please subscribe to my channel. For those of you new here, I do 3 videos a week, Monday, Wednesday, Saturday, and drop me a like, share with anyone who you think would find this video interesting, and until next time.